Thank you. And yeah, thanks to everyone here for making it back after lunch, especially on such a beautiful day. Might as well just crack on. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about settlement scaling theory, agent-based models, and ancient trade. And essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is a kind of, I guess, a mashup that me and Tom have been doing, which is to take the kind of models that I've been working on over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, which are the settlement scaling theory side of things, and incorporate them with agent-based models, and in particular Mercury model, and see, what happens when you combine the insights of both together. His name should really be on the bottom of this as well. So, I mean, the central issue that I want to be talking about is this idea that there's been, as we all know, there's been this excitement recently about the potential of agent-based models to shed light on fundamental aspects of the ancient economy. But one of the limitations of these models, I think, is that they've not taken sufficient account of the effects of scale. This is quite natural, given that it's only really recently that we started to have an understanding of how, in particular, sizes of settlements changed. So, this raises a couple of questions. I mean, in particular, what effect did the sizes of settlements have on trade in the Roman Empire? But also, we know that the properties of settlement don't change in a linear way with size. So how did social networks change as the numbers of people involved in them increased? But also, how did division of labour change as the sizes of settlements increased? And of course, what impact did all of this have on the degree of economic integration in the Roman Empire? So, really, there have been two developments, I think, that allow us to try to sort of tackle some of these big questions in a slightly more nuanced way. The first is the idea that there's been a development of sophisticated models for how the attributes of settlements change as the numbers of individuals who reside in them increases. These are the settlement scaling models that I just talked about. But also the idea of the development of new estimates for the numbers of residents in ancient cities, however crude. By this we really mean that it's possible to approximate the rough order of magnitude of size. So, this allows us to combine the new understanding that we have about agglomeration with the existing models that we have for ancient trade, and therefore to offer an updated version of Brughmans and Poble's agent-based model. And this should allow us to investigate the effects of, first of all, including more realistic information about the sizes of sites. In the original model, it's essentially there's a simulated urban hierarchy, not an empirically derived one. But secondly, allowing both the numbers of traders and the numbers of their social contacts to vary with size. So as cities get bigger, you don't necessarily have an even proportion of traders in each settlement. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then the final thing is specifying where the main production centres are. This has actually proved to be the kind of most sticky issue, and I don't think we quite anticipated that, but I'll come on to that again in a minute. Okay, so this is nearly the last texty slide, I promise. This comes from the theoretical and empirical basis of what we're doing is settlement scaling theory. To define this is a formal model for how the attributes of settlements change as the numbers of individuals who reside in them increases. And this is based on a conception of social networks embedded in the built environment. So this is about how individuals interact, balancing the costs of interaction with the benefits of interaction. The idea is essentially this will create a form of a spatial equilibrium, which is conditional upon the actual built environment. There's basically quite a large stream of research on this now. It's still a very active area. So if you want references and stuff, talk to me at the end. This allows us to come up with a general model for how the relationship between the sizes of settlements and the nature of the social networks and the extent of division of labour. So the idea here is that the densities of settlements increase as the numbers of inhabitants increase. That makes sense if you think about compare somewhere like, let's say, Lubbock in Texas with New York. New York is clearly a much more dense settlement than Lubbock. This means that each individual can sustain a large number of social contacts. the greater the density you live at, the more likely you are to run into someone, to set up a social relationship with them. And this in turn means that that individual can concentrate on a narrow range of tasks, relying on other individuals to perform the remaining tasks. So you think about this, in an isolated individual, you have to do everything for yourself. I'm sure my wife knows this. When I go away, she has to do absolutely everything. I'm infuriated when she goes to conferences. On the other hand, if you are in an increasingly connected social community, you can divide up tasks and specialize and become better at them. This is the division of labor that Adam Smith talks about. Okay, so then just to put this in mathematical language, in a formal model, we can say that the area, or the number of people living in a certain area increases according to this equation here. So the alpha there is just a baseline density, the n is the population of assessment, and then this is just an exponent, slightly sublinear. But the numbers of inhabitants and social contacts increases at slightly sublinear rate, and the infuriating thing about PowerPoint means that there's another equation which you can't see. Okay. But anyway, luckily I've got this slide, so I can just use that. Basically, if you could see that last equation, you'd be able to, you would understand, I think, that the total number of social contacts increases faster than population, but the overall division of labour increases slower, although it still increases. Which means that this is what allows sites to not only be more diverse in absolute terms, but also to be more specialised per capita. This has been a bit of a kind of conflict, I think, in urban studies, that the seeming greater diversity of assessment, but also their increasing specialisation. At first, those two things contradict each other. Okay. One important caveat, though, is that this doesn't make predictions about specific occupations. So it's still very difficult to come up with a formal model for, say, traders, in our case. But the recent research on contemporary cities in the US does show that numbers involved in retail tends to scale sublinearly, i.e. slower than population, while the numbers of individuals involved in creative sectors tends to increase faster, so superlinearly. So yeah, just to illustrate this, these are the scaling exponents. That's that 1 minus beta or 1 plus beta. And essentially you can see that there are some things where it makes a lot of sense, that there are efficiency gains, like agriculture, forestry, fishing. As cities get bigger, you expect there to be less of those. Whereas other things are the kind of more bang for your buck experience of cities. So professional, scientific and tech services, these are not usually the province of small cities. These are usually the province of very large assessments. But somewhere in the middle, just slightly under sublinear, is the retail, transportation and warehouses. So that might be the best way of instantiating the traders that are in the ABM we were talking about. Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, so far this is all very theoretical. So far this is mainly derived from modern experience. I'm working on trying to get the kind of occupational data to back this up. All of the theory so far suggests that there's nothing contingent upon the modern world. I haven't mentioned industrialization or capitalism. I haven't mentioned monetarization. So there's no reason why these models can't be applied to the past. And in fact, there's really quite a large corpus of evidence that now suggests that the scaling models are applicable to the past. One potential route is just to take some of the most well-known occupations, the Centenari, the Fabbri, potentially the Dendrophori, although there's some debate about that, and just count the numbers of occupations for assessment. The issue really is just the handling the data that we've got. So yeah, you'll see the Hanson in preparation, maybe. But yeah, this is just showing the numbers of inscriptions. I would take a database of 500,000 inscriptions any day. Unfortunately, it's still very difficult to correlate that to population size. So there's a little bit more work to be done there, but possibly the problem here is that we're combining a static population figure in terms of the built environment with a population density applied to it to a process of accumulation, recycling, and loss. There are ways of modelling that, but they're a little bit complicated. The best evidence we have is professional associations. So these are the kind of institutions that in non-professional company are called guilds. But there are several reasons why it's not necessarily a useful term to use. And essentially, if you take an index of the numbers of documented guilds in each settlement, you can see that there is a relationship between population size and that index of guilds. That index is basically derived from working out how many guilds there are per number of inscriptions per settlement, and then timesing that by population. You're doing that because you've essentially turned it into a density of occupations, although it does introduce some multicolumnarity effect. But essentially this is showing that as settlements increase, the numbers of known associations increases, but at a slower rate than population. So this is adding some support to the theory as I spoke about before. Okay, then finally, the last thing we did was to take a subset of known cities. This is from my catalogue. The total catalogue includes 1,388 sites, but because the evidence that the original agent-based model was compared to was ceramics from the East, you need to take a subset of that data. So we ended up just working with 464 sites. And then you can derive population from taking the area and applying a scaling effect to density. And again, we take a subset there, which gives us 885. There are 885 sites in total. There are 264 that we can work with here. Okay. So right, onto the model. So essentially we can just do two or three things. The first is to test with and without agglomeration social network effects, i.e. with and without scaling of social contacts, but also to look at occupational structures. So one hypothesis that the number of traders is linear. Another one is that it's sublinear. So we use a kind of sliding scale to reflect different situations. And then finally, with and without specifying production centers. And then we tested it against the tableware that's been used before. Okay, so I'll wrap up quite quickly. Yeah, I mean the advantage of agent-based models is obviously you spit out a series of different models. So I'll just summarize the major findings here. The most important one is that we can reproduce the original results. So adding in the scaling relationships doesn't perturbate the model that much, although it requires some tinkering. The most interesting is that it shows a much larger variance when we use the real data for cities. I think this is kind of what we'd expect. I see this as a necessary step towards creating more accurate and precise models, that introducing empirically observed data basically fucks things up, but actually in a way that's adding more coarseness and more reality. The second thing is that changing the average numbers of social contacts actually has very little effects on the results. This is kind of quite curious, because that interaction with other people is the core of what the settlement scaling models are, but also they're the core of pretty much every other aspect of economic geography, urban geography as well, and in fact they're the core of our own discipline, archaeology and anthropology. So yeah, I mean that might be because of the way we've instantiated social networks, social relationships in the models, so you might need to think a little bit more about that. The most clear-cut result, though, is that the average numbers of... Yeah, sorry, I'll move on. So the strongest results are when we fix production sites. The final, most, I think, kind of interesting thing is just to say that in doing so, this adds some support to the idea that the inhabitants of larger cities did have more social contacts, because we can replicate the model by adding in that assumption, at least on average. So that adds not only some support to the data I showed you a few slides back of the occupational structure and how that scales, but it is also interesting to see that allowing the number of traders to increase at a sublinear fashion confirms our suspicion that they were they are best classed as retailers. So they're not super creatives. Yeah, so there's more work to be done here, particularly with how the intersite links shape up. But I think I'll leave it there because it's probably enough for now. And it only remains to thank the British Academy for keeping my body and soul together.